Hey everyone! I've been really itching to make a faux fur jacket. I thought that one would look really nice with the dress that I was wearing to that masquerade ball that I went to a few weeks ago. And then with Lindy posted a tutorial on how to make one using a thrifted jacket with faux fur, and I thought that that was a sign I had to make one. So yeah, I tweaked her tutorial a little bit to kind of make it my own, so I thought that I would show you guys what I did. Of course, I'll leave a link to hers down below so that you can check hers out as well. So, let's get started. Instead of using a thrifted jacket like Wendy did, I'm using this shirt that I wanted to try making into the inner lining. I did have to alter it a little bit at first though. I wanted to make the sleeves a tad skinnier, and I eventually had to cut down the middle front so that, it can open like a jacket. I held off on cutting this part though until I was ready to sew the fur to it. I used the shirt to make the pattern for the jacket. To do this, I simply just traced the shirt onto some paper. For the front piece, I folded the shirt in half, placed it onto the paper, and traced. To do the sleeve curve, I just held down the seam, flipped the sleeve over, and then made a mark in that spot. I repeated that a few times until there was enough to connect the dots together to make the arch. I did this for all the spots where there were curves. Basically just the sleeve and the collar. Then I added a 1/4 seam allowance all the way around. One change that I did that was different to Wendy's was that I wanted to try adding a pocket in a different way. A couple inches from the edge, I made a mark all the way from the top to bottom, like so. I just kind of guesstimated how far in to do this. This now makes this into 2 pieces. So technically, I'm going to have 4 pieces in total for the front. I made a note to add a seam allowance to this when I trace it onto fabric, and then I also ended up making another note to add a few more inches along the inner edge. My plan was to have the fur fabric on this edge fold over onto itself along this edge, so that if it flips open a little bit, then you would see a bit of fur first and not just immediately see the lining. I also added a couple inches to the bottom and to the end of the sleeves for the same reason. Anyway, I went through and made pattern pieces for each part of the jacket, labeling them as I went. The main front panel and the small side front panel, the back panel, and the sleeve. The sleeve part is a bit tricky. Usually the curve is slightly different on the front side and the back side, so I traced the seam, marked it as front or back, and then I flipped it over to copy the rest of it onto the other side. I cut each piece out and started tracing them onto the faux fur fabric. You need to make sure the direction of the fur is running in the direction you want it to. Now typically, you cut the pieces so the fur points down, but I decided to cut the pieces so that the fur was pointing up instead. When the fur is long enough, like mine is, this gives it a neat effect where the fur seems fuller and more bouncy and whatnot. I actually saw this technique used on the Tested YouTube channel when Adam Savage was making a Totoro costume. He did the same technique to make the fur stick out a bit more and not look so neat or whatever. I fully recommend checking out his Totoro build. Really any of his builds, they're really fun to watch. I also cut 2 pairs of fabric rectangles, big enough to fit my phone, to make the pockets. I took one of the main front pieces and then pinned a pocket piece onto it, a few inches up from the bottom, right sides touching. I repeated this on the smaller front piece for that side, and then sewed the pocket pieces to each of them. I lined up the front pieces, pinned them together, and then sewed along this edge, and then this is what I had afterwards. With this long fur, you can't even tell where that seam is. One last thing I did to hold the pocket in place so that it wouldn't droop weirdly was to stitch it up right here. Again, with this long fur, you can't see that stitch. Once sewed up, I ran a comb over it to get any of the fur that happened to be stuck in the stitches out. And then I repeated this for the other front piece. Now I lined up the front pieces onto the back piece, right sides touching, and pinned and sewed up the shoulder seams. I unfolded these pieces and then pinned the sleeves in place, right sides touching, making sure to place them correctly. The front curve of the sleeve should line up to the front piece of the jacket, and then the back curve to the back. And then I sewed them up. Then I folded the front pieces back over the back, lining up the sleeve edges and the body piece edges like so, as always, right sides touching, and then I sewed it up. And then all I had to do was to sew it into the lining. I just pinned the faux fur and lining together, right sides touching, lining up at all the raw edges, and then I sewed them up, leaving a few inches on the bottom so that I can flip it out. Once I sewed all the edges, I flipped it out, and well, I guess I should have waited to sew up the sleeves, because this is not right. I didn't feel like trying to seam rip this seam, and I had a little bit of extra fabric on the sleeves anyway, so I just cut the ends off and then redid the seams. So yeah, I redid these seams, and then I also sewed up the bottom, and then I was done. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like, and if you want to see more, then feel free to subscribe. Don't forget to go check out With Wendy's tutorial down below. She has a bunch of cool videos. I've actually used a few of her tutorials before and made videos on them. So yeah, go check her out. Thank you to my patrons for helping me produce this video. If you are interested in becoming a patron, I'll leave a link to mine right up here and you can go check it out. If you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, please leave a comment down below, and I'll see you next week.